Welcome back, friends, to another episode of the Micro Solidarity Podcast. We've got a special interview today. Some of you may have heard last week I interviewed Andrew Rose from Fractal in New York City, and I was very impressed with everything that he had to teach me about how to run a successful community space. And one of the things that was really striking in that conversation, both to me, but also comments that we heard from the audience, is wow, Andrew really must have had some special parenting. Like there seems to be something about his character that sets him apart from a lot of our peers, that there's almost like a missing nutrient maybe, or some X factor that means that he shows up with a sense of responsibility and joy and willingness to take risks and generosity. And it's just got a whole cluster of really good virtues and values that a lot of people really resonated with and were really excited about. Like, wow, I really like this guy, and I want to be a bit more like him. And I had the thought, well, maybe I should go to the source and see where he comes from. And you were so gracious to say yes to an interview, Jeannine. So I wanted to hear more about, yeah, how do you think about parenting? Where did this guy come from? Yeah, I don't really know where the conversation is going to go. I just want to know a bit more about his background and what role you played in it.
Okay, I will do my best to say I feel like yeah, for me there were a lot of conscious aspects to parenting, but I also think a lot of it was just living, doing it and trying to be the best, person I could be for my kids. Um, I do have to say he's my third, and so I feel like by the time I got to him, I had learned a lot. Um, And first of all, parenting is, I feel, one of the, while being one of the most amazing, joyful, wonderful experiences, it's also the hardest thing to do, I think, because there's so much responsibility that comes with it. And there's so many ways you can mess up. And the good thing is, I feel like kids are pretty resilient and, can kind of overcome mistakes as parents that we make. But, um, you know, there's just so many ways to do it. And when I was a parent, when I started becoming a parent, there weren't as many resources to look to for help. It was kind of um, like you parented how you were parented. That's how I started. And
Mm.
I knew I wanted to do better because my parents, they tried really hard. I know that, but it was a whole different time. Um, there was a lot, there were many, I guess they just parented differently. It was a parenting out of fear. That was
Mm.
kind of the parenting style that my parents had, was like, if you do these things, there will be bad consequences for you, you know? And I really didn't want that for my kids. I didn't want them to be afraid. Um, so I know with my first son, since I had no good examples of parenting at that time, um, I think I did parent to more to that end where it was kind of like, okay, if you're doing something that I need to correct, maybe there'll be a spanking, maybe there'll be whatever, or maybe I start yelling. And I came to realize very quickly that kids today, I would say your generation, I don't know how much older my oldest, he's 34. And he didn't respond to that. There was zero response. It was like, spank me all you want. I'm going to still do what I'm going to do. And I had to really sit and think, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? How am I going to get to this kid without, because I can't keep upping the ante. Nothing's working with that. He needed a different kind of approach. I feel like your generation and younger, it takes something, it takes a more conscious parenting. Um it takes a more thoughtful parenting. And so by the time I got to Andrew, I feel like I figured some things out. Um and I did, and I'm gonna say I didn't do a terrible job with my first ones,
Yeah.
but I feel like the first one especially, it was kind of experimenting about how to do it well. So and I will say, okay, to go back to before I was a parent, I did think about it a lot, and I always knew I wanted to be a mother. That was always kind of a goal. And I ended up becoming a mother much younger than I had planned to because of just circumstances
Mm.
in life. And I had been going to college. Um, I was in pre-med, and then there was just a lot of really some hard times in my family I grew up in. And as a result, I ended up dropping out of college, and I just started working, and then I met my now husband and fell in love, and we just ended up getting married, and I had a kid right away. So but I remember discussing this with him and saying, okay, if we're having kids, one of us has to be here. Like that was extremely important to me. And no judgment for anyone else. You have to do what's right for you. But for me, because of my own family, my mom had to go to work when I was 5. And I remember how heartbroken I was. And so I said, one of us is going to be home for these kids. And we're going to be here when they get home from school. And I'm going to be here. And we're going to, be able to drive them to things and pick them up and just be present so they know someone's always here. So for me, that was extremely important. Uh, and so fortunately, we were in a position where with, the work my husband did, we were able to afford to have me be able to be home raising the kids. Um, and I think that did make a big difference. Um, and the other thing I really thought about is I did want education to me was really important. Um, and I started them young with, I read to them from the time they were babies. I read. Just tons of books. Mm. And, nursery rhymes and singing and all those things. And trying, teaching them to read early and teaching them basic math. And, those things I thought, I'm going to do that. They'll have a head start when they get to school. Um, and I think that did help. Um, as far as Andrew goes, I feel like all my kids, and I'm a proud mom, but all my kids I feel like are extremely intelligent, very bright. They were always very bright, always excelled at school, were in the gifted programs, all that stuff. So they were all very, very smart and are very smart and all very successful. Um, I feel like Andrew, in some ways, he just, when he was born, he was, I feel like he just was born with this joy that was just, um, I don't know, it was just unusual. And all my kids, they were happy little kids. They were sweet, happy, cute, got into mischief, all those things. But Andrew had this thing where he just went through the world happy. And I remember him once he was, maybe a year old, where he was sitting, if I went shopping, I took him to the grocery store, for example, and I put him in the cart and I'm pushing him around. And the whole time we're going through the grocery store, he's singing and he's smiling and he's happy. And I just remember him always having such a happy, joyful demeanor and always making friends wherever he went. He was always not shy at all. He would go right up to people and he would, want to be friends with them and want to play and kids. I remember when he was little. I know when he got older, I feel like he went through some difficult, more awkward times in his growth. But when he was, little, um, people just gravitated to him. Little kids gravitated to him. He just made friends very easily. And so I feel like, maybe that's different. I don't know. Maybe
Mm.
there's a lot of kids like that. I'm not really sure. That was just him. Um, and so the other thing I did with Andrew that was a little different than the older two is I didn't put the older two into preschool. Um, I just taught them at home, and I felt like, okay, it's better for them to, I just thought it was better for them to just kind of bond with me and get a really good base before they start public education. And with Andrew, I just remember he was just always thirsting for more. I could just tell he wanted more, more, more. And then only one person. And there was his dad, but his dad was working. And he I feel like he just needed more than just being at home and playing and me reading to him and whatever we were doing, playing with friends. And so I did find a preschool for him that was kind of like an alternative, new kind of a new form of preschool. This woman who started this preschool had ideas for how kids should learn that were not typical. And I thought, okay, this seems like a good place for him. And so I did put him in preschool at 3. Um, he loved it and did, I think it was good for him. He seemed to need more socialization. Uh, um, so I feel like, I don't know if that made a difference. I'm not sure, um, but I feel like Andrew, I don't know. He was a pretty easy kid to raise. Trying to think of what else. Um, I don't know. Do you have questions right now? I feel like I'm kind of
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I really just enjoy hearing you kind of describe how
okay.
you've thought about this. First question is, you mentioned briefly about the way that you were raised and realizing like that's not how I want to do it. And
Mhm,
so my question is like, if you're not using fear as the way to sort of shape someone's character and their behavior, what
mhm.
what else? What are the other options?
What are the options? So the options that I found were, uh, we tried the timeout thing. That sort of worked. Um, I feel I feel like it was more about had to just for me, it was like I had to listen more to them. And if I listened more to what they were really like, what was really going on with them, what was really the issue, then I could, it seemed to, it seemed like their behavior just automatically changed. And I don't think they felt a need to act out as much. Um, and gosh, I'm trying to remember what I did. I'm having a hard time remembering now. Um, because I don't think I never ever spanked Andrew or his younger sister. Mm. And I'm trying to think what I did. There were some timeouts. There were go sit and think about this kind of things. Um, but I don't know, maybe I'm forgetting what
Yeah.
he really liked because I don't remember having to discipline a lot.
Yeah. No.
Um, okay, so this is the other thing that makes me think about something. Also, is that I came to the realization at some point that, okay, like these are my kids. I gave birth to them, but I don't own them. Like they're their own being. Like
Mm.
they're a soul. They now have a body. Yeah, they're young and um and they need, caring for and they need guidance. And so I remember my husband and I talked about it and I said, I feel like I don't want to, the kids don't have to be what I want them to be. That isn't my job. Like both, not so much my husband's parents were kind of like, they kept kind of pushing towards something that they wanted them to do or wanted them to be, or you need to do this instead of just letting themselves emerge. And I said, I think our job is more to be like the bumper guards, kind of like at bowling, where, okay, we got to keep them in this zone of safety, but they're, they were born to be who they are meant to be. They were just born to be that. And our job is to just be here to love them and to keep them safe and feed them and take care of them and provide them opportunities. But it isn't our job to say, to force them or to try and mold them into something I want them to be, because I don't think that's my job. I didn't think that was my job. And so I think that also helped. Um, because it wasn't me fighting up against them all the time with, I need you to do this. I need you to do that. You have to do this. And so I think that did help.
No.
Um, and I don't know.
I I'm getting the impression that it's like hard to know what to describe because things were working smoothly. It's like you kind of found a method that worked for everyone. And so it's like, oh, this process of development is kind of just happening naturally as it should. And it's just
Yeah, that is
surprisingly
kind of
rare.
how, exactly. And that is kind of how I think parenting worked for me. And did I make mistakes? Oh yeah, I made mistakes. Um, are there things like those are the things that if I think back now, um, there's things that there were some incidents, with the kids where they push you to your limit and you act in a way that is not, not good parenting, not, but I feel like also kids need to see parents being like human, and the world isn't perfect. people in the world, you're going to encounter all sorts of people in the world, and they're not always going to be perfect. They're going to make mistakes. They're not always going to be nice to you. And I feel like it's also, you have to, I feel like that's a kind of a way for them to, you know, maybe realize that people that love you, and I loved them, I love them so much, but it doesn't mean I'm infallible, you know. And so, I mean, Andrew, when he was a teenager, could be challenging, and I loved him to death. He was so smart and so capable and had so many ideas, and but he loved to argue about everything, and he took stances on things, and I know it was just part of his growing up, becoming, gaining maturity, but he would take stances on things that I would just be, I would try to correct him and say, but no, that's not right. That's not the way things are. And he, I have a little thing here. I got this for Andrew. Can you read
I'm
it?
not arguing. I'm just explaining why I am right. Amazing.
This I got for Andrew. Yeah. And so, but I look back on it and I'm like, it was fine. If that's the worst he and I butted heads were those kind of things, then, you know, it's fine. He was like growing into himself, and, and he wasn't a bad kid. Like, Andrew was not, he was a really good kid. Um, like, I feel like that's the worst of his, the things problems I had with him were just his incessant arguing about certain things. And in fact, that kind of caused me to grow as a person. I'm hoping it helped his dad to grow, because he and his dad would butt heads. But it made me really think. And there was one time he and I argued, and I said something that to this day I regret. And and it's just a weak moment of, just getting
Mm,
frustrated.
mm.
And I think as a parent, you have to forgive yourself for that stuff, and apologize to your kids for, just having a human moment, having a weak moment, and saying, I'm really sorry, that I said that. And um but like I said, there's no manual for being a parent. It's the
Yeah,
hardest thing. I think it's the hardest thing I've ever done.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Um,
there's so many ways you can veer off. And those are my biggest regrets, are parenting mistakes I feel like I made. Yeah.
mm.
And they still turned out fine, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
It sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, earlier you were saying something about acting out and sort of behavioral issues and things, that instead of fear, you're using like a really deep sense of listening and like getting to the bottom of understanding what's going on for this little guy. And that
mhm.
if you could deliver that sense of being understood, that would sort of like resolve whatever upset was going on. And am I getting you?
I think that really does help. Um, it really does help, because I feel like, especially when they're really young, they're just trying to communicate with you,
Mm,
and a lot of times they can't, like, if they're not speaking well, or they don't have language, or and they get frustrated, I mean, I remember Andrew getting so frustrated because I couldn't understand what he was trying to say to me, that, you know, he would start crying, and he would cry so hard that he would lay on the floor and stop breathing, because he couldn't communicate to me what he was trying to get across. And my other kids did similar
Mm.
things. And I think that's what a lot of tantrums are about, is the fact that they're trying to tell you something, and we're so busy, we're always in a hurry, we're always trying to do a million things, and we don't take the time to stop and listen to them and try to understand. And there's not always time for that, because sometimes you do have to go and do things, and there's other things. But as much as you can, I do think that really helps.
Mm.
Yes.
Mm.
And it still works even as they get older. Um, I feel like listening is really important. Um, I feel like just being there is important. Just a presence that they know that it's kind of like they can fall back on. If
Yeah.
life is tough, mom's home, and um, I can get a hug, or I can get, some love or a snack or whatever, and I feel like there's really a sense of, you know, I think it gives some confidence to them in the fact that they're not alone. Because I do remember feeling that as a kid myself, when my mom had to go to work, and it was, I'd come home from school and there was something I had to talk to her about, or I need a permission slip signed, or it was just, everything was just hassle. I just remembered that.
Yeah.
And then I became a person who's like, well, I'm so stressed. She worked so hard, and my dad and she weren't getting along, and I'm like, well, I can't bring my problems to her because she has too many of her own. So then you just pull it all inside and just try to be a good girl, or whatever. And I didn't want my kids to do that. I'm like, I want them to know that, you know, they're, extremely important, and nothing's more important than that. So yeah.
Mm.
So anyway.
It's really quite touching to just hear you talk about this and imagine, yeah, what it's like to have that kind of not just presence, but also space and capacity and like, hey, I've got time for you. Like, what's going on?
Hmm. Hmm.
I was just curious about what was the dynamic between mum and dad? Like you and your husband, how did the roles kind of play out between the two of you as it comes to parenting?
So okay, so first of all, I remember discussing with my husband, we always talked about how, okay, we have to be on the same page. And if we're not on the same page, we need to talk about this off by ourselves. So one of the big rules for us was we didn't, we didn't, okay, so let's say I did something and he didn't agree with me. He's not going to talk to me about it in front of the kids. He's not going to say, no, we're not doing that. It would be when we're off at the end of the night or in a different room, or that we discuss it and go, hey, I don't really agree with that. I don't think we should do that. Or I think we should do it this way. So we didn't argue about parenting in front of the kids for the most part. Who knows? Maybe we slipped up a few times. I don't know, but can ask the kids. I don't know. But that was our one of the big things. So the other is that the job that my husband had um took him away from home a lot. So he traveled a lot. And I remember after Andrew was born, um, he had just gotten a new position, and his boss wanted him in New York City like 2 weeks out of the month. And I'm just like, how am I going to do this alone? And and we live in Arizona. So it was him flying off every other week to be in New York for a week or sometimes 2 weeks at a time. And I'm home with, when Andrew was born, it was 3 little kids. And we didn't have family here. We didn't, I didn't have a ton of friends because we had just moved here not that long before. And so I feel like a lot of the parenting was on me. Um, and when he'd come home, while we tried to do family things together, um, work was still like a big part of what he had, like, I think he felt that responsibility immensely because he was the breadwinner. He's trying to do the best he can to, provide for our family. But when he was home, he was home. He didn't have any other outside really activities. Like he was home and we had a swimming pool and it was like every afternoon in the summer it was like, okay, 3 o'clock, it's pool time, and the whole family would go in the pool and he would, grill food and he was, I would say he was tougher than I was with the kids. I think he had higher expectations. And I would say the kids would probably say that too. He was a little tougher, but I think it seems typical of dads. But um, you know, also I think the way he was parented was a little more like that also. So he did parent maybe a little more like the way he was parented. Um, and he was maybe a little more old fashioned about like don't sass me back and that kind of thing. Like I'm your father, which I feel like is valid. Like kids need to treat their parents with respect. And but I think maybe it was a little hard because he was gone so much. And um so I felt like a lot of the time I was a single parent. And um and so I think maybe there was some difficulty because he would be gone and then he would come home. And then the dynamic in the house would change between
Yeah.
when he was gone and when he was home. Um, so, you know, but I would say for the most part, I was the one who was like day to day there with the kids, like,
Yeah. Gotcha.
all day
Gotcha.
long. And I mean, he loves his kids immensely. They were everything to him and they are everything to him still. It's just, I think he felt his duty as a provider was like his focus,
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
But that's actually one of the things that I want to sort of dig into a little bit is this question of duty or responsibility or like it really feels like Andrew and the friends that he's attracted and the project that he's doing sort of exemplifies a kind of civic responsibility. Like
mhm.
I'm on this planet to do well by my family and my neighborhood and to contribute something meaningful, and I'm going to take on all this extra stress and risk because
Mhm.
it's worth it because we're making things better for everybody. And I'm really
Right.
curious, where does that impulse come from?
I don't, I mean, honestly, I don't know if I know.
Mm.
I feel like Andrew, I mean, obviously, you know, we parented him and we were examples, whether he looks at that and goes, I want to be like that or I don't know. I mean, I'm sure he looked at his dad and saw the hard work he put in. Um, and maybe, and he saw that example of just really, really being responsible, working hard. Um, Another thing with his dad is uh, like I would say he's probably of anyone I've ever met the most um word isn't coming to me, but like his word is his bond, and he will not, um like he was in sales, so, but his philosophy in sales was never, I'm never going to mislead my clients, I'm never going to lie to them just to get a sale, I'm never going to be dishonest. If I said I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it. um and my job isn't, my job is to help you help yourself. That was how he ran his business, was like, I'm going to help you by selling you something that will help you, you know. And um so I feel like the fact that he lived with such integrity, it had to translate, down to the kids. um and that's still how he lives. He probably has some of the most integrity of anyone, like I said, I've ever met. So I think that was really important. I don't know, what else did you ask?
Yeah, I'm just digging around for where does this responsibility gene come from? It's interesting to see the connection with
Mhm.
integrity, that like words matter, and if I say something, I'm going to live up to it, and I'm careful about making commitments that I can live up
Mhm.
to.
Mhm. Yeah. So maybe that has something to do with Andrew. And I feel like Andrew, it also seems like Andrew, I feel like he almost was born with this mission. I don't know how to describe it. I feel like it's just part of him. And he's learned along the way with meeting people. I know he had in high school, he had a really close friend group, and they would, you know, get together often and hang out, and they were all very close. And I think they had close enough friendships that they could be like really honest with each other about like character flaws or things that they thought you were like, if you were messing up, I think they would call each other out. And so I think that also played a part in how he's gotten to this point, um, of realizing the kind of relationships he wants to have in his life. I'm not sure where this sense of feeling like he has to, you know, he has like a mission, in the world. I feel like that was just in him, you know, because like I said, I have three other kids and they're all really intelligent and all really, um, you know, doing great things in their lives. But I feel like none of them really have that kind of drive. They have drives in their own careers or their own personal lives, but it's not the same as Andrew. So,
Mm. It's fun
yeah.
to think about. I see some common patterns in the way that I was raised as well. So,
Hmm.
like you said about the bumpers, the bowling bumpers, like
Hmm.
a message I got again and again from my mother was, "You are capable of really impressive, amazing things. I don't care what they are, but you have to live up to your potential." Like from her
Hmm.
perspective, it's like this: you've got a God-given gift here. You have to use it, and I'll be surprised and delighted with what you come up with, but you've got to do something.
Hmm. Hmm.
And
Hmm.
it sounds like a bit of the same. Yeah.
Right, right. And I feel like, I never, um, Andrew was never like an underachiever as far as, like you have all this potential and you're wasting it. Like I never felt that with him. And I feel like I never had those kind of conversations where like you have this and you got to do something with it. I don't think I ever had that with him. Um, I think I just knew he would, you know. Um, he
But
always seemed to have this inner drive to just keep achieving more. Um, the biggest, I mean, one of the biggest things I had with him was as far as underachieving. Let's say if you call this underachieving, I don't know. But he had a class in, like middle school, and it was a high school level class, so it counted as toward his high school scores. And he's like a math genius, and he is like, I already know this stuff. Why do I have to do the homework? And so he wouldn't do his homework, and I'd check on the computer and I'd check his scores, and I'm like, Andrew, come on, you have to do your homework. And he's like, why? I know how to do this already. I don't need to do the homework. And I said, well, if you want to get an A in the class, you do, because it's just the rules. The rules are the rules. The rules are you got to turn in your homework so you can get graded on it and you can get the score. And it was just like pulling teeth with him to get this math homework turned in. And finally, I just decided to give up on it. And I said, his grade, and I am not going to keep harping on this. And so I just let it go. And he got a B, not an A. And it was fine until he was graduating from high school. And then the grade counted toward his rank in high school. And he still was really high up there, but he said to me, he's like, why didn't you make me get an A in math? Why didn't you make me? And I laughed and I said, are you kidding? Are you kidding me right now? I said, do you not remember all the times I harped on you about turning in your homework? And and I think he did see that, but that
that points to one of the questions that I had as well, was about, I just wanted to hear how you think about autonomy, like letting him make his own choices, make his own mistakes, like how, if you're so present and so connected with what's going on for him, how do you let him fail or like get a B when he's capable of an A plus?
So that also was a learning process for me. With my oldest, I have to say I probably did too much for him because I didn't want him to fail. And so I would be there, and be there like late at night if he didn't get his paper done, and I'd be helping him finish his paper and helping him finish a project. And so I feel like I do feel like I did too much. And so there came a point when I realized, okay, this isn't really helping, because they really need to learn to do this on their own. And if they need my help, I'm happy to help, but I'm not going to be there hounding them and then sitting with them. I'm like, there has to be some consequence to not, not meeting their responsibilities. So I feel like I did better as I went along with each kid. And also, every kid is different. This is a thing that shocked me. I didn't realize, I came from a family with 7 kids, and I guess we were all different, but I remember having my children, and from the first one to the second, I was shocked at how different they were, and the different requirements they had, and the different personalities, um, and I remembered, well, they came from the same 2 people. Why are they so different? And they just are. I feel like that goes back to the point that I think they're born. I think I think children are born with kind of who they're meant to be growing through life. And I think if you just provide them a loving home and guidance and the bumpers, I think they'll get there. If there's, as long as there's not a situation where they're being abused or hurt or mistreated or, neglected. I think kids will become who they're meant to be with just a little bit of guidance, a little bit of bumpers, a lot of love, some safety. But I'm not a fan of I'm not a fan of the helicopter parenting.
Yeah, no.
I feel like that's one of the biggest differences now compared to like when I was a kid is the fact that kids today, we're so scared. As parents, we're so scared of all the things that could happen to them. You know, we don't want any bad things to happen to them. And I was the same way. And I have to say, I did, you know, with social media, with the news, with TV, it's like they're presenting to you, you know, kidnappings and abductions and kids getting hurt, and a kid got hurt on a bouncy gym, or, you know, trampoline, and all these things. And it's going through your mind all the time. And you're like, oh, I can't let that happen to my kid. But they have to live, and they have, you know, you can't protect them from everything bad ever happening to them. And that's really hard as a parent. And I think parents today are so afraid of all the bad things that could happen that they don't let kids live freely. And I know I did some of that. And you know, like I said, we live in Arizona, and just the landscape is inhospitable. You know, they go outside and it's like there's cactus, there's rattlesnakes, you know, they could get hurt. And so, and you know, people drive too fast through the neighborhood, and I used to worry when they'd ride their bikes, you know. And so I do think I succumbed to some of that. Um, but I kind of wish it could be more like when I was a kid, where like you would get up in the morning, and I had responsibilities in my household. So we had chores to do and those things. And then when we got to go play, it was like nobody had cell phones. My parents couldn't just call us. You know, we just went out into the neighborhood, found the kids in the neighborhood who were like outside playing. We all got together and we got up to all sorts of mischief and had a lot of fun, and we learned a lot. And I feel like that led to me feeling really capable in life. You know, by the time I was an adult, I felt like I can do anything. Whatever I decide I want to do, I can do it. And I think a lot of it came from just that freedom to just explore and live and do. And I find when my kids were growing up, there were so many parents that were so scared to let their kids do things. So, and everything is scheduled now. That was the other thing that really got me, was your kid's life is so scheduled. I feel like it's too scheduled. You know, they get up, you know, 6:30 in the morning, got to be to school by 7 or 7:30. And then they go to school for how many ever hours. And then there's, you know, lessons and sports and this and that, and they never really get to be kids. And I mean, I'm not going to lie, we did some of that too, because I wanted them to have the opportunities. So there were music lessons, and there were soccer, you know, there was soccer and t-ball and had, you know, swimming lessons and all those things. But I remember I tried hard to have sections of time where there weren't those things. And I tried not to, let's say, for example, in the summertime, okay, I'd sign them up for swimming lessons or maybe one class, but I tried to have them just have free time where they could just be themselves. And I feel like I feel like kids are way too overscheduled now. And I'm not sure it's really in the long term helpful. Parents are trying, they think, well, it's going to give my kids an advantage because they're going to have all of these things they know how to do, but they don't then have real practical life experience. I feel like, you know, so.
That's interesting. This is part of it. This is part of what I'm trying to get at, is like, where does someone get the sense that they can go and create something new and deal with all the complexity of the world when the answers are not clear and there's a lot of uncertainty and there's risk and you hope it works and you don't know if it will. It sounds like part of that, this commitment to the unstructured time is part of the training ground for that. Like, this is what the real world is like. You have to figure it out. There's not a real clear, this is the person in charge, and these are the rules, and these are the outcomes. Like, life is more fluid than that. It seemed like you were getting towards a question that I had in my mind already, which was basically for the young parents that are listening. What's your advice? It feels like you've already touched a couple, but is there one message that you'd really love to land with new parents?
Um, I think, wow, I don't know if there's just one. I think realizing, like I said, that they are their own person. Like, you gave birth to them, but they are their own being. They are a soul that incarnated to be something, and they have their own mission, I think, when they're born. And I think it's good for parents to really realize that and I think just give them as much love as you can, and let them know how much you love them, and keep them, in the safety bumpers, but also let them emerge, let who they're meant to be emerge. Um, and also just forgive yourself when you make mistakes. Parenting is so hard. It's really hard. And you're going to make mistakes. But as long as your kids know that you love them unconditionally, and it doesn't matter what they do, it will never change how much you love them. I think everything in the long run will be okay. You'll get through the hard times.
Mhm.
And it is challenging, and there's going to be some hard times, and there are times, and I'm kind of going off on a tangent now, but I do remember times when I was being really challenged as a parent, because I had 3 boys, and they were, full of energy and full of ideas and full of sometimes mischief and being naughty, and I was pulling my hair out. And I remembered thinking, it would be a lot easier for me personally if I went back to work and I put these kids in daycare. I remembered thinking that. And I'm like, but I can't do that because they need, you know, but I remember thinking that, and I'm not saying, and then, like I said, no judgment on anybody's decisions with how they parent. Um, and I'm not even saying that would have been easier. It was just a thought that went through my head, because I know going to work is very challenging, and you still have to come home, and you still have to do the laundry and make dinner and all those things. So that's not an easy path either. But I thought, well, geez, maybe I could just have somebody else deal with all this stuff, because they're really getting on my nerves. So there are going to be lots of moments like that, and you get through them. And I don't know. The other thing is, I guess you have to find out what are your limits, what are the rules you think you need to have. I feel like I didn't have a lot of rules for my kids. Or I didn't need to like lay it out. I didn't need to lay out, these are the rules, because they just kind of knew. And for example, when they were in high school, none of them ever had a curfew, but none of them, they were always home. They were always home. By the time it would have been like before midnight or whatever the age was that they were at. And so I feel like because I didn't lay down such strict rules, they didn't feel a need to push against them and rebel. It's just not, I mean, I just thought that for me that worked well, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
And they didn't, and I didn't ever have issues with them pushing up against to rebel. They never were the kids who went out and got drunk and came home drunk, or um, you know, I think because I didn't have those really strict, you will never do this kind of thing like my parents did. It was the you will never, you're not going to drink, you're not going to ever do drugs, you're not going to go out to parties, you're not, or out late partying, I guess, with your friends. And I felt like all that led to was us going, don't tell me what I can and can't do. I'm gonna do it. And I feel like my kids they never did that. So, and I know they did some things, I know they did some stuff, but it was all just more innocent um and I don't know if that's good or not good, but that's just what I think.
That's interesting though. Like, you're not laying down really strict rules, so that's not activating this rebellion, but then they're still taking responsibility and being serious about, growing up and going to school and what they need to do. And I can imagine someone who's like, oh, I don't have strict rules with my kids, and then the kids just kind of are free range and they don't have a sense of direction, or that they don't have good priorities or something.
Yeah, I never had that. And I think maybe they just sort of knew, maybe they just knew kind of the boundaries just because of that's how we lived. Maybe, I guess I would have to ask them, how did they know, like what boundaries they could push or not? Um, but they knew like, okay, there were certain, I guess I wouldn't call it a rule. It's just like, how do you behave? How do you treat people? How do you um, you have responsibilities at home, those kind of things. It was just givens. It wasn't me explicitly saying, this is what you have to do. It was just kind of, they just knew. So I don't know, that
I've got one
sounds
last.
kind of vague. That sounds very vague, but it worked.
Yeah, the proof is in the pudding, right?
I guess.
I've got one last question. I'm thinking about some of my friends who will be listening and feeling like longing, like I didn't get that kind of parenting. And I wanted to just, how do I frame the question exactly? It's like, so when your kids leave home and they're kind of out of your reach a little bit, you kind of exist to an extent, like a voice in their head or a sense of some feeling that they have in the world or something like that. And I'd love to be able to just encapsulate, like, what is that little Jeannine that lives in Andrew's head? Like, do you know what I'm getting at?
I know, but what's interesting about that is I don't know. I don't really know what that is for him. Like what are the memories he has that if he thinks about home or growing up, I'd actually be curious to know, like, what is it that he thinks of, like, for him, what was the best part of his parenting? Um, yeah, that's interesting. I feel for me, if what I would like them to remember is that I was just always there. I was, that mom was always there. Like if we ever needed her, if we, when we came home from school, when we, she was home, she was there. And to me, I feel like that's just super important. So, um, and it, like I said, it can't always be that way. And I understand that, especially in today's world, it's really
Yeah.
challenging to just have one income household. That's really tough. And in as much as you might want to, it just might not be doable. I understand that, but then I guess when you're with your kids, be as present as you can and let them know how much they're loved and how much, you mean to them and that you are the most important.
Well, thank you so much. That's it's been a really precious way to spend an hour and just get inside your world a little bit and take the pulse of a kind of parenting that I really admire. And I want to say thank you for the interview, but thank you for the good work you did with making these great people. I think the results speak for themselves.
Okay, well, I hope it was helpful. You know, I know a lot of it is just, for me, it was just doing it. So I don't even know how to always even describe it, but hopefully there were some good things there.
Yeah, I think you've been super articulate. Thanks, Jeannine.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Bye.